Hello, everyone, and welcome to Registrar Corp's webinar on FDA requirements for animal feed. My name is Jonathan Rhodes, and I will be one of your presenters today. I'm joined today by my colleague Melissa Sayers from Registrar Corp's Drug Division, who later during the presentation will talk to you about medicated animal feed requirements. Our presentation will conclude with a live questions and answers session. If we run out of time, we are also happy to respond to your questions by email. You may submit a written question at any time during the webinar by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. A recorded copy of this presentation will be sent to all registrants. With that, I'd like to go ahead and begin. So today we're going to talk about a few things revolving around FDA requirements for animal feed. So first, we're going to talk about how animal feed is regulated. Two, we're going to look at how animal food is regulated as a food product. Next, we're going to talk about how animal feed is regulated as a drug product in medicated animal feed. We'll do a questions and answers session, and we'll also provide you some information to contact us if you have further questions or need further assistance with your animal feed regulations. So first, we're going to examine how animal feed is regulated by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And to answer that question, we need to ask, what is animal feed? So animal feed is food that is intended for consumption by animals. And that kind of seems obvious, but it's really important when we start to talk about the difference between animal food and medicated animal feed. This includes pet foods for cats, dogs, any type of animal that you may have, and those intended to feed livestock and other farm animals. If an animal food is more than 3% raw meat, 2% cooked meat, or 3% raw poultry, or 2% cooked poultry, this product is instead regulated by the United States Department of Agriculture instead of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So just a very important fact to keep in mind. Typically, when we talk about food that's regulated by FDA, we're talking about a lot of grain products, animal products, and things like that. So when we talk about the difference between animal food and animal drug products, we need to establish some definitions. So the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually defines food as articles used for food or drink for man or other animals. And of course, animal food is foods that are intended for consumption by animals. These are regulated and overseen by the FDA Center of Veterinary Medicine. And then this center also regulates the medicated animal feed, which is also known as drugs, that we'll discuss just a bit down the slide. When we talk about dietary supplements, these are non-existent for animal products. And so anything that we typically think of as a supplement in human terms, where we have dietary supplements for our human diets, this is either going to be classified as an animal food product or an animal drug product. And this is widely due to the intended use of the product. So when we get down to drugs, products are classified as drugs based on the ingredients that are present in them. So do they contain active ingredients that are involved in animal drug products, or do they include claims on their labeling or their packaging that say that they intend to mitigate, prevent, or treat disease? These things might classify animal feed as medicated animal feed, which may classify it as a drug product. And so the Center of Veterinary Medicine actually is the one who makes this determination based on some example claims established in a compliance policy guide that the code for is listed on the screen. So first, we're going to talk about how FDA regulates animal food products as food. And so if you're not selling your medicated animal feed to the U.S., if you're just selling an animal food product, these regulations are likely to apply to you. And so animal foods require certain FDA regulations, such as FDA food facility registration, prior notice, compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act, which involves at least two different rules under that act: the Foreign Supplier Verification Program that affects U.S. importers of animal feed, and the Preventive Controls for Animal Food regulation that affects the, we have exporters listed there. However, that's anyone who manufactures animal feed for consumption within the U.S. So this would include domestic facilities. We also have labeling requirements that are established for animal food products. So first, we're going to talk about FDA registration. FDA registration for food products results from the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. And so what FDA did here was, under that act that was written into law by Congress, FDA requires facilities to manufacture, process, pack, or store food to register with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And with that, any facility that is not located within the United States must also designate a U.S. agent. So the U.S. agent is an entity that must be physically present within the United States. They must have a U.S. address, and they must be available 24 hours a day to respond to important FDA communications. So FDA might send information about inspection notifications to a U.S. agent, or they may seek the U.S. agent to answer questions on behalf of the facility. So it's really important that if you're located outside the United States, you designate a U.S. agent that's familiar with FDA regulations and knows what they're doing, knows how to respond to FDA in these scenarios. The registration typically contains some information about the facility and contact information, what products are being manufactured or handled at the facility. And what this registration essentially is a notification to FDA that you're manufacturing, processing, packing, or storing animal food to send to the U.S. And you're telling them where the facility is located, which we'll kind of talk about in a later slide, have some implications for inspection of your facility. Some exemptions to the FDA registration do apply. So when we talk about trading companies, these are companies that do not come in direct contact with food. They don't process the food. They're really just moving, taking food and then moving it. Personal residences do not need to register. Transportation only is similar to the trading companies. If you're just moving food and you're not handling it, not packaging it, etc., you do not need to register. Farms do not need to register unless they engage in any sort of processing activity. So for example, if you are a farm that harvests grains that would be consumed by animals, you don't need to register. However, if you then process those grains in any way, thermally or however, you would need to register with the US FDA. Retail food establishments do not need to register, so those are, of course, grocery stores and distributors. Fishing vessels do not need to register, and facilities that are regulated entirely by the United States Department of Agriculture do not need to register with the US FDA. They will be subject to an entirely different set of regulations under the USDA. And so we also have the food facility registration renewal. So we talked about how in 2002 they established this requirement to register. Well, in 2011, when the Food Safety Modernization Act was passed, it mandated this biennial registration renewal. So what this means is that every 2 years, on even numbered years, every food facility that is registered with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration must renew their registration. And so it doesn't matter whether you registered initially in April of an even numbered year. So for example, if I registered in April of 2020, I still needed to renew my registration at the end of 2020. If I actually registered this year in 2021, I would need to renew my registration in 2022 during this renewal period. This renewal period occurs every 2 years between October 1st and December 31st for all FDA regulated food facilities. And essentially what happens is failure to renew a registration properly and by the deadline will result in a canceled registration, because what FDA will do is they'll find all the facilities that did not renew their registration, and they'll clean up their database at the beginning of the odd numbered years. So for example, in 2021, following the renewal period that ended on December 31st of 2020, FDA actually removed 25% of their food facilities from the registration database, which is a fairly substantial number, but it typically is within the range of 20 to 25%. And this is mainly because facilities, they don't renew properly or they don't renew on time. Next, I want to talk about FDA prior notice. And so this is very relevant if you're located outside of the United States and you're intending to export your animal feed into the United States. So what the prior notice is, it's a notification to FDA before every shipment of animal feed comes into the United States. So even if you're sending a sample to a trade show for a buyer, or you're just sending a sample in general, any shipment of animal feed requires this prior notice. And if you don't file this prior notice, it's very likely the product is going to be detained in the port. What the prior notice is at its core is this notification that the shipment is arriving, including information about what's in the shipment, so the individual products that are inside it, what kind of packaging are they in, how many of them are there, who is the manufacturer of these products, who is the purchaser, the consignee, and who is shipping these products, information such as that. This can be filed by an exporter, it can be filed by an importer, it can be filed by a third party who has knowledge of the shipment. Registrar Corp files hundreds of prior notices a day on behalf of facilities all around the world. But the important thing is that it gets filed. And there's a specific timeline for filing the prior notice, which depends on the shipment's method of transit. Next, I want to talk about animal food additives. And so these are, of course, additives that you would include in your animal food to supplement it. And so the way that animal food additives work is that additives that are generally recognized as safe and effective, generally recognized as safe, which is abbreviated as GRAS, do not require any FDA approval to be marketed inside of an animal food product. So examples of additives that might fall into this GRAS category include grains, certain vitamins, certain minerals. And then there are, of course, other additives that don't really fall into those categories. But FDA has established a list of permitted additives to be used inside animal food. And these include hydrogenated corn syrup, formaldehyde, polyethylene, taurine. So all of these are established in this 21 CFR 573. So 21 CFR 573 actually has fairly established definitions for what these animal food additives are and what their chemical properties are. So if you have a question about whether or not a certain animal food additive is permitted, you can reference that regulation, or you can simply contact Registrar Corp and we can help you with that. If you have a food additive that is non-GRAS, so it's not part of that list, or it's not considered generally recognized as safe, it's not part of that list, you must petition for FDA to use the non-GRAS additive. And so this involves identifying the ingredients that are within the additive, providing some scientific data on the effects of the additive, identifying the intended use, because as Melissa will talk about later, this gets into some interesting territory when we talk about the difference between a intended use of food, and intended use of a drug product. And then you also must conduct safety evaluations. And then, of course, if you are using food additives that are not recognized as safe or not on that permitted list, they would be considered adulterated by FDA, which may cause issues in court, such as detentions and even refusals. FDA may look at the product and refuse its entry into the United States. And so next I want to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act. And of course, this is a very large buzzword in industry for the past several years, and it's kind of taken full swing. You might often see it abbreviated as FSMA. And so FSMA was passed in 2011, and really you can see this timeline below. It started taking full swing around 2016, and now that we're in 2021, most of the deadlines that affect most food manufacturers and animal food manufacturers have passed under FSMA. So it introduced rules that applied to both importers and exporters of animal food products. Our U.S. importers are required to develop foreign supplier verification programs, and we'll talk about what those mean in a second. And then U.S. exporters, or manufacturers, I should definitely make that clear, manufacturers of animal feed products are required to develop food safety plans. And these are based on hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. So sometimes you may hear it called a HARP-C plan, sometimes it's called a food safety plan, but it's based off of these HARP-C standards that FDA has established. So first I'm going to talk about foreign supplier verification programs, and these apply to U.S. importers of food. So if you're not a U.S. importer, you wouldn't have to do a foreign supplier verification program. However, it's still really important for you to be aware that your U.S. importer is required to do this. So some of the activities that they may ask you to perform, or some of the things they might ask you for, may be related to this. At the core, U.S. importers must perform risk-based foreign supplier verification activities to verify that their food that they import is produced in compliance with applicable FDA regulations. So particularly the preventive controls requirements that I will talk about in a few slides. Importers are generally looking to see that their suppliers are in compliance with those, because they're required to provide adequate assurances that the suppliers are in compliance with the preventive controls regulation. They also need to verify that the food is not adulterated and that the food is not misbranded, concerning food allergens in particular. And so, of course, it boils down to a lot of things, but this may involve several types of verification activities, including sampling of the food, on-site audits of the facilities that they import from. They may monitor the facility's compliance with FDA food safety requirements and FDA regulations. The importer has a checklist of things that they need to do to comply with this, but they may implement it in different ways. What this typically does is it aligns with requirements for the supply chain program that's established in the preventive controls regulation. So those of you who have your HARP-C plans in place might find the supply chain program familiar, and it's a little similar to the FSVP that the importers have to conduct. And so when we look at the FSVP's components, these involve starting not at the very top, but just next to it, we have a hazard analysis. So the importer is conducting a hazard analysis of all reasonably known or foreseeable hazards that the food could encounter for each food category from each of their foreign suppliers. They're also conducting an evaluation and approval of those suppliers, so that, as I said, they're providing adequate assurances that the suppliers manufacturing food that they consider to be of the same level of public health protection provided under the preventive controls rules. They're conducting supplier verification activities, such as the on-site auditing, monitoring FDA compliance, etc. And then they're establishing corrective actions. So if there is non-compliance, or if something goes wrong at the manufacturing plant, they're establishing corrective actions for how they're going to control hazards and maintain the safety of the food. Continuous monitoring, they may choose to monitor their suppliers because they're required to know whether their supplier is affected by a US FDA import alert, whether the supplier's had a warning letter. So many importers often choose to monitor and look daily, regularly at FDA databases to see whether their supplier's name pops up under an FDA enforcement action. And then this must be developed by a qualified individual. You may have heard of a preventive controls qualified individual, which we'll again talk about in a few slides. A qualified individual is not quite a preventive controls qualified individual, but this is just somebody who is qualified through education or through experience to maintain the activities of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And then we have FSVP importer identification. The FSVP importer is the legal owner of the food as it enters into the United States. So it's the consignee of the goods, the owner at the port of entry, and this must be identified when the entry is submitted through customs. So if you are an importer, or maybe you're an exporter, whoever is purchasing that good and owns it at the time of entry, they're responsible for conducting this FSVP. And then lastly, we have record keeping, which is also relevant to preventive controls. You just want to make sure that you're documenting all of these components through every step of the way, because FSVP inspections in particular are largely document-based. So as I had stated, FSVPs are required for each food category by each foreign supplier. And so in this little illustration we have 3 suppliers on the right, and you can see the error for the food safety plan going over to the importer, just checking the box. Importers oftentimes choose to check their suppliers' food safety plans in order to be compliant with the FSVP requirements. So FSVP requires them to provide the adequate assurances that their suppliers meet the same level of public health protection established by preventive controls. Well, great evidence for that is a compliant food safety plan by the supplier. So many importers choose to use the food safety plan to demonstrate that. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the preventive controls. So these are going to affect the manufacturers and the exporters of the animal food products. So preventive controls are intended to reduce risks associated with FDA-registered human and animal food facilities. So, of course, we're talking about animal food today, but this also affects human food, and it's very, very similar. And this includes food additives, GRAS substances, dietary ingredients, and then how this is through several methods of controls. And they might be sanitation controls, they might be supply chain controls, recall plans, but there are a lot of different controls that are involved in this. So when we talk about a food safety plan under preventive controls, FDA requires most FDA-registered facilities to have a food safety plan, and a food safety plan sometimes is a little nebulous because many of you may have already a HACCP plan. We are aware that a lot of companies throughout the world use HACCP, or they're certified under some sort of GFSI scheme that requires a really, really robust food safety system. The food safety plan is a little broad, but FDA is looking for a few things in particular, and they establish those, again, under the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls standards. So just to go over a very quick overview of the differences between HACCP and HARPC, when you're looking at the hazard analysis in HACCP, you typically look at the biological, chemical, and physical hazards. In the food safety plan that FDA requires, you need to look for those things as well. However, you also need to consider chemical hazards including radiological ones, and you need to also consider the cases of adulteration that is economically motivated. So just a few nuances there. I won't belabor this list because this will be available in the recording, but we also have critical control points for processes. When we talk about the HARP-C plan, it's a little bit different because we talk about preventive controls, and these are not always at your critical control points. They may be at your critical control points, but they may be controlled at other points that are not critical control points, such as throughout the supply chain in your supply chain program. So there's, of course, this list of the differences. Registrar Corp also has a very helpful infographic that addresses the differences here. The thing that I just want to point out that's most important is that if you have a HACCP plan in and of itself, it may not be enough to satisfy the HARP-C requirements. You need to have these other things that FDA is looking for inside your food safety plan. And so just as we had that graph before that showed us the components of the FSVP, you'll notice that a lot of these things are similar, so I won't belabor them so much. But again, we're looking for known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that are identified for a particular food product at a facility. We're looking at preventive controls for controlling those hazards. So steps I'm going to take, maybe this involves if I perceive a biological hazard, a pathogen at some point during my process, I might apply a kill step later in the process to control that hazard. I need to establish monitoring procedures to make sure that the controls that I'm implementing are actually getting done. I need to have corrective actions to make sure that if they're not, we can rectify that, and what does that rectification look like? I need to have procedures in place to verify that my controls and all of these pieces of my system that I'm implementing are working as intended. I also need to have a supply chain program, which is very similar to the FSVP, where I'm examining hazards within my supply chain and I'm establishing controls for hazards that are not controlled by my suppliers for of course, my raw ingredient materials, or even if I'm bringing in some sort of finished product. I need to establish a recall plan. So this is, of course, what do I do if the food needs to be recalled? How do I notify stakeholders? How do I notify consumers? How do I get the product lifted from the shelves? And then record keeping. So, of course, you want to document absolutely everything, your hazard analysis, the preventive controls that you implement, the monitoring procedures, because when FDA comes to inspect your food safety plan, they will want to see the evidence that the food safety plan is being implemented as intended. And then reanalysis of this food safety plan is required continuously. Every 3 years, the food safety plan must be reanalyzed and reevaluated. However, if changes are made within the processes, any step along the way, it's really important to reanalyze the food safety plan and to maybe revise it according to those new processes. And then lastly, this one is very important. The food safety plan must be written and overseen / implemented by a preventive controls qualified individual. So they say preventive controls qualified individual, particularly, this is someone who has the proper education or experience to develop a food and implement a food safety system, or they've undergone some sort of specific training. So for example, the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance has a specialized training that trains you to become a preventive controls qualified individual. Just an important thing to note, there are some modified requirements under the preventive controls rule, and these apply to what are called qualified facilities and very small businesses. Now, there's a lot of overlap here, and so before I explain what these mean, the modified requirements typically are that the food safety plan requirements are not as intensive. You're not required to have as robust of a food safety plan written down as a typical facility would. However, FDA is going to, if you want to have your facility a qualified facility, you need to file a qualified facility attestation. So you need to essentially tell FDA that you meet these requirements that I'm going to describe, and you need to have proof that you meet these requirements. Otherwise, you may be subject to the full regulation of the preventive controls rule. And so, not to belabor the point, because a lot of this can be a little confusing, but generally, if you're an animal food manufacturer or processor that averages less than $2,500,000 in annual sales plus the market value of unsold food inventory, then you meet this qualification for the modified requirements. There is a definition down there, qualified facility. If you have sales that are fewer than $500,000 per year, and the majority of your sales are to local consumers, then you also meet this definition. But there's a lot of overlap in between the qualified facility and the very small business. So typically, if you have the average of less than 2.5 million in annual sales plus unsold food inventory, these modified requirements would likely apply to you. However, you need to have some sort of documentation that proves that you meet these requirements in case FDA comes to inspect you and they want to see evidence, because this modification does provide you some exemptions from the preventive controls rule. And then, of course, I want to talk about animal food labeling requirements. So animal food labels are a bit different from what we typically see on our human food labels. They don't have the nutrition facts chart that we would typically see. But what they do require at a very high level is the name of the product, a description of the product. So this is the type of product, the form it is marketed in, such as sliced or whole, the ingredients that are inside the product, place of operation, and the number of servings. So it's very important to follow all the FDA animal food labeling regulations, because mislabeling an animal food label can lead to detentions or other regulatory action. Of course, labeling errors are the leading cause of detentions for food products entering the United States. They make up 22% of all detentions. And then, of course, as we're going to talk about with the medicated animal feed, additionally, making claims about foods that can cure, prevent, or treat symptoms of illness can lead them to be classified as a new animal drug product. So Melissa will talk about the animal drug product regulations in just a moment, but it's important that if you have any claims that result in that intend to cure, prevent, or treat disease, your product may be considered a drug under FDA's requirements. And then, of course, we have the established codified regulation, 21 CFR 501, which establishes all the requirements for labels. If you have questions about that, Registrar Corp's regulatory specialists are very happy to help. And so without further ado, I'd again like to introduce my colleague, Melissa Sayers, who heads the Registrar Corp Drug Division. She's going to talk to you now about the medicated animal food requirements and how these claims can make your product a medicated animal food.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. We will now talk about medicated animal food. So, per the regulations, anyone that is adding a drug to an animal feed, by definition, is creating a medicated feed. By this action, the facility is subject to FDA drug regulations, and there are certain animal feed mills that are required to be licensed with FDA. These would be ones that are manufacturing certain liquid and free choice medicated feeds. We have here on the slide the definition for a Category 2 medicated feed and a Type A medicated feed. The Category 2 requires a withdrawal period at the lowest level for at least one major species for which they are approved or are regulated on a no residue basis with a zero tolerance because of carcinogenic concern, regardless of whether a withdrawal period is required in any species. A Type A is intended solely for use in the manufacture of another Type A medicated article or a Type B or Type C medicated feed. It consists of at least one new animal drug with or without a carrier or with or without inactive ingredients. Regulations require a medicated animal feed facility to submit an application for a drug not already approved by FDA. They must hold an approved license, register its drug establishment as a manufacturer when initially manufacturing, and must re-register on an annual basis. Type A facilities must register and list its products, whereas Type B and Type C facilities are exempt from the listing requirements. A license requires the facility to certify that the feeds or drugs are manufactured in accordance with FDA's guidelines set forth by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The methods used in manufacturing must follow current good manufacturing practices, and it's also necessary to keep all records. Each drug that is used in animal feed must be approved by FDA, and the drug must also be added in allowable amounts and are not to exceed those amounts. Any facility or individual that violates the medicated animal feed regulations are subject to regulatory action by FDA, and the feed may also be seized. So, drug establishment registration is an electronic submission that informs FDA that your facility engages in manufacturing activities of drug products, either in the United States or offered for import into the United States. Facilities that register with the FDA as a drug manufacturing establishment are required to register annually between October 1st and December 31st, as long as the establishment continues to manufacture drug products. The registration must include a data universal numbering system, which is also known as a DUNS number. DUNS numbers are managed by a private entity known as Dun & Bradstreet. They're not affiliated with the FDA by any means. DUNS numbers are provided at no cost by Dun & Bradstreet for purposes of FDA registration. The site address of the manufacturing facility must be included in the registration so FDA knows where the medicated animal feed is being produced. The business operation is the type of manufacturing activity that's occurring at the facility, such as manufacturing, packing, labeling, or medicated animal feed manufacturing for the purposes of this webinar. A contact person must also be provided in the registration for FDA to be able to reach, such as for notice of inspection or warning letters or et cetera, for any kind of correspondence that FDA may need to get in touch with the facility. If the establishment is a foreign establishment, a U.S. importer or importers must be included on the registration. If the shipment is shipped without including the United States importer listed, the shipment may be detained or refused entry if the registration is not updated promptly. This is a delay that can be easily avoided if the registration is updated prior to shipping, and it happens all the time. Also, a United States agent must be appointed for a foreign establishment, which Registrar Corp can assist with. And the role of the U.S. agent is to help with correspondence, especially when there's time zone differences, et cetera. It's very helpful for the FDA to try to get in contact with a foreign establishment by a U.S. agent. As part of our service, we do issue out a certificate to show that your facility's been registered with the FDA. It's a tool that you can use to show your customers that you've complied with that requirement. This is not an indication that you are approved, that your facility is approved. That does not denote that. And it is not issued by the FDA. It's something that we do as a courtesy so you can show that, hey, my facility is registered with the FDA. I've met this requirement. Okay. So another electronic submission requirement that applies to some medicated feed establishments, such as Type A, are required to submit product information to the FDA. Both the drug establishment registration and drug product listings are submitted in a format known as Structured Pragmatic Labeling, SPL format. It's using XML code. So every drug is required to have its own unique assigned number, known as a National Drug Code number or an NDC number. The NDC number comprises of 3 segments. The first segment is a labeler code. This is assigned by the FDA and identifies the labeler of the listing. The labeler code is to be shared among all sites under common ownership, so this number is company specific. It's not site specific like the DUNS number. The DUNS number is unique to each establishment. The second segment identifies the drug product. It is unique to the product based on the product's name, dosage form, route of administration, the formulation, and physical characteristics, especially like when it's a tablet, how big is a tablet, the color, the score, or the flavor that's added, such as cherry. The third segment identifies the packaging. This includes the type of packaging, whether it's a bag, a carton, a jar, etc., and the quantity within that packaging. These 3 numbers with dashes in between is what makes up the NDC number. Also, a copy of the labeling is required to be included in the submission. So what is the purpose of a product listing? FDA requires drug products to be listed as it informs FDA what drug products are in commercial distribution, what products a manufacturer manufactures, and what products is a private label distributor distributes. In case you're not familiar with the term private label distributor, it's a company that contracts another company to manufacture the drug product, uses its company name on the label for distribution. So the contract manufacturer would not include its name on the labeling, but in place, the private label distributor is named on the labeling and distributes the product. All registered drug establishments must list all the products that they produce for commercial distribution, unless otherwise exempt under 21 CFR Part 207, Section 13. All manufacturers, repackagers, relabelers, or salvagers of Type B or Type C Medicaid animal feeds are exempt from listing, but they're still required to register. So up to this point, we have discussed what a Medicaid animal feed license is, what is a drug establishment registration, as well as what is a drug product listing. The drug that is being used in the Medicaid animal feed must be approved for use by the FDA. If the drug is not approved, a new animal drug application must be submitted. The application will need to include the drug's chemistry, its ingredients. The application will need to include how the drug is manufactured, include a sample of labeling, and most importantly, data. Data that's proving that the drug is safe and effective. To prove that the drug is safe, this includes safe for animal consumption, safe for those administering the drug, and safe for food products derived from the animal. Okay, that's a lot of things that they have to prove that it's safe for all those different aspects. Medicaid animal feed labeling is subject to regulations, the very same regulations as non-medicated animal feed. Animal feeds become medicated through the addition of drug products, as well as claims about certain health benefits. When making a claim on a label, each claim must be approved by FDA. FDA approves the claims when the product consistently does what the label says it will do. And labels are required to be approved by FDA. The label must state what species it is for. The active drug ingredients and inactive other ingredients must be included. Directions including how much to administer, how long the feed should be used for, as well as caution statements and warnings are required on the labeling.
Thank you, Melissa. Again, I would like to announce that we will be sending a recorded copy of this webinar to all of our registrants today. And without further ado, we do see some questions in here, and we'd like to take this time to do some questions and answers. Before we do that, I just want to talk about a few things that Registrar Corp can help with today. We provide a full range of fixed fee compliance services regarding all of the requirements that we talked about during this webinar. So we assist with registration and U.S. agent for both food facilities and drug establishments around the world. We assist with prior notice filings, filing hundreds of prior notices a day through our prior notice express system that can reduce the prior notice filing time by 50%. We also can conduct a full labeling, ingredient, and product review. So if you're not actually sure whether your animal feed is a drug product or not, we can take a look at the label and we can provide you a report that provides the correct labeling for your product, as well as a label that you can use on your packaging. We offer a full range of food safety and FSMA compliance services. So, for example, the food safety plan that I discussed, if you're importing food, the foreign supplier verification programs, we can assist with that as well. And then, of course, I'd like to point out that we also offer a 100% online self-paced preventive controls qualified individual training. We can conduct a mock food facility inspection at your facility where we'll dispatch a food scientist to examine your facility and look for the things that FDA would typically look for and provide feedback for adjustments that you can make prior to an inspection. And then, of course, if your shipment is detained and you're experiencing problems in the port, we can communicate on your behalf with FDA to help take the corrective actions and work the shipment quickly to its final destination. I'm going to put our contact information up on the slide here. You can see our U.S. office here in Hampton, Virginia. If you have any questions that we're not able to get to today, or you just have questions in general, you can always contact us here using the phone numbers listed or info@registrarcorp.com, or you can also contact one of our offices, our global offices that can provide multilingual and regional support. Simply pull up their contact information at www.registrarcorp.com/offices. So our first question today is, are 3PL, or so third-party logistics companies that do not take ownership, exempt from the regulations as a trading company or a transportation-only company? So this is an interesting question. When we're talking about food products, companies that are only transporting. So, for example, FDA doesn't really distinguish companies. They distinguish the kind of function of the companies. If you are not manufacturing, processing, packing, or storing food, and you're only transporting it, then you would not be subject to the food facility registration regulation, which in turn would exempt you from the preventive controls requirements. However, it's important to note that the supplier, in this case, or the shipper, whoever you're moving the product for, they must be registered with FDA. So if you have a relationship with them that you want to ensure that they're compliant, they're required to register as a food facility. If the product is medicated, there are certain requirements under drug regulations that do apply to third-party logistics companies. If that is the case, I encourage you to contact info@registrarcorp.com to find out some more information. Our next question, under FDA registration exemptions, it says farms are exempted. Can you please clarify? Yes, so if, just going back to the grain example, if I am only harvesting grain and I'm just harvesting crops or something that may be used in animal feed, I'm not required to register with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. However, the moment that I begin to process that, so if I have, some sort of thermal processing that I conduct at the facility, or pasteurization or any type of processing that occurs to the food, that's when I need to register with FDA. But harvesting only, I'm not required to. Our next question, animal food additives, grass. In this case, would it be that soybeans do not require FDA approval? So just to back up on the FDA approval nomenclature, to be super clear. So we have used the word FDA approval a lot during this presentation because when it comes to drug products, FDA approval is typically a common thing for certain types of drug products. However, in the food world, we don't really use approval because the products are not approved by FDA. FDA establishes regulations that permit food products to enter interstate commerce, and then they enforce those. But we don't really, FDA doesn't really approve the products. So just to answer your question, if the soybeans are considered generally recognized as safe, they are, if they're considered grass, they are acceptable. However, I do encourage you to reach out to us at info@registrarcorp.com because I'm not sure. There might be some aspects of soybeans considering allergens that might be something to look at. Our next question. If I understood well, I need the product list with its NDC number per product registered. Also, with the registration of the facility, is any inspection necessary from the FDA for exporting feeds? So this looks like a two-part question. So Melissa, the first part, do I need the product list with its NDC number per product registered?
We don't, without further information, I cannot confirm or deny that. Like I stated in an earlier slide, there are some exemptions to the product listing. If your facility does not fall under the exemption for type B or type C medicated animal feed, then it may appear that your product, for your if it's a medicated animal feed, such as the type A, you may have to list the product, and for each product you have, it would need its own unique NDC number. And basically, yes, if you are manufacturing medicated animal feed, it will be required to register the facility as well as have a license. Those are two different types, submissions per se. And as for inspection, upon registration of a facility as a drug manufacturer, including medicated animal feeds, you're subject to inspection. FDA inspects to check, if you're following current good manufacturing practices, etc. But the inspections are based on a risk-based schedule. It's not something that you can request. It's not something that it's not required in order to import into the United States. As long as you're following the registration, if applicable, the listing requirements, your license, if you're following all the regulations to the labeling and using the drugs that have been approved, or if you filed your application and gotten it approved, etc. As long as you follow the regulations in that respect, you could, in theory, import into the United States without it being inspected. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Melissa. Our next question regarding registration renewal. This is only on October, November, and December. And so this is a great question. Yeah, just to reiterate this, because I might have gone a little fast there. What happens with registration renewal for food facilities? Drug facilities are slightly different, but food facilities are required to once they register with FDA, they're required to renew that registration every 2 years between October 1st and December 31st of that year. So it does not matter if I registered for the very first time in March of 2022 next year. I will still have to renew that registration in between October and December of 2022. And so FDA just uses this as an opportunity to sync all of their registrations together at the end of the calendar year. And so this does also apply to drug registrations. The difference is that with food registrations, it's a biannual requirement on even numbered years. However, for drug registrations, it is an annual requirement. So facilities that handle medicated animal feed would have to renew their registration every single year. Our next question, in order for customs clearance into the United States, what are the documentation requirements? So I'm going to take this question from kind of an FDA regulatory standpoint, because there are some documents that a customs broker might provide to Customs and Border Protection that might be outside of the scope of what we're dealing with today. However, I can just things to make sure that you have before you ship to the United States. You're going to want to have an FDA registration. So, for example, if you ship to the United States without the FDA registration, it's very likely that your shipment is going to be detained, and it can even be refused. You're not necessarily, showing your registration in a documentation. However, it is provided in the prior notice that you file with FDA. So, for example, if someone is, you're shipping your product over to the United States, inside the prior notice that must be submitted to FDA, it does contain the manufacturer's registration number. So the prior notice is also a very, very crucial thing to submit. Without that, the shipment will likely face detention and just be held up in port in general until a prior notice is filed. The other thing that's important, again, not to backtrack on the question a little bit, but FDA doesn't really, it's not so much that FDA is going to look for your food safety plan at the port or look for your labels at the port. Like they're not going to go through every single shipment and do that. They're using their own kind of risk-based systems to decide which shipments do they stop and take a look at. The registration number is key. You definitely want to have the registration number, but you also want to make sure that your labels are compliant. You're not submitting your labels to FDA for approval, but your labels should be compliant, because if FDA stops your shipment and looks at them and they see that they're not compliant, they're going to detain the shipment at port, and your product can be refused based on that. So FDA kind of works in this role as an enforcer. Additionally, with the food safety plan, you're not necessarily submitting that to FDA at the port. You're implementing this food safety system within the manufacturing facility or within the processing facility or packaging facility. And FDA, when you register with them, you consent to an inspection. So if FDA comes to your facility, they're going to want to see documentation that you're implementing this food safety system as you claim to be implementing it, especially if you're an FDA registered facility. So there's really this expectation that you're complying with the regulations, and they're there to enforce that. And if they find non-compliance, they may take enforcement action. So, for example, if you don't have a food safety plan and they come to inspect your facility, they may issue a citation that could lead to future problems. We know that some facilities have been put under import alert for this. They've had products refused in the port, or they've received warning letters. It really depends on the discretion of FDA in that regard. Okay, so we are running out of time, but I would like to have one more question. Of course, if we did not get to your question, I really do encourage you to contact us at the email address listed on the slide. But our last question, by listing my medicated animal feed, does that approve the labeling? Melissa, this sounds like a good question.
No, it does not. So the listing is just to notify FDA of what drugs are being produced, and who's manufacturing them, and who's distributing them. In that respect, if their name's on it as a private label distributor. For a product to be approved, it has to go through the new drug animal application process. Only through that is a drug, quote unquote, approved. Drug listing is not reviewed by the FDA. It's not approved by any means. The Drug Establishment and Registration, as well as the drug product listing submissions, are just to notify FDA who's manufacturing, what activities they're doing, and what they're manufacturing. It is no approval. Your facility is not approved. Your product is not approved. And if you were to say that your facility is approved, FDA approved, or use FDA's logo, and that your facility, your company could get into serious trouble. So we highly discourage that. Please do not mix up terms. Just say it for what it is. My facility is registered. My product is listed. Do not confuse a listing as an approval. Okay? You can say a new drug application has been approved by FDA. That's really the only appropriate time to use that term. Your facility has been licensed. Use the terms that are part of that submission, and that should help you not get into any unnecessary trouble with the FDA.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. So we are out of time, but of course you can send us additional questions anytime by email to info@registrarcorp.com or contact one of our global offices around the world for multilingual and regional support. This concludes our presentation, and I would like to thank everybody for joining us today.